So tonight we're here to talk to you guys about empowering your students to manage anxiety. So let's just kind of start with the general definition of anxiety. And I think this is really important because as we go through this presentation, I'm going to talk about anxiety as an emotion and also a disorder. So anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. So stop and think about that for a second. Who hasn't had this feeling before in their life? And I'm going to challenge you, who hasn't had this feeling in the past year of their life, especially when you talk about that uncertain outcome. The other thing I want to talk about with anxiety is when we go through this and I go through the strategies, I'm going to break it down. What's difficult about anxiety is it's got a physical component, which we often see in our students. It's also got a cognitive component, which is going to be kind of their thought processes and what they're saying to themselves. And then that behavioral component, what they're doing with it. But it's really important as I go forward with these slides to remind you guys, anxiety in and of itself is not negative. And this is one of the most important pieces we can do as the adults in their lives, is almost re-educate them on what anxiety is. You can go to the next slide, thank you. So let's start with some benefits of anxiety. So think about what anxiety in our body really is. It's a warning sign. It typically tells us, hey, something's not going right. I might need to make a change. It tells us that there's something important or to pay attention to. That's a good thing. It can also be extremely motivational when you think about performing on stage in a performance, competitions, tests. This motivational piece can be very good for us. It's a built-in alert system. So when you break this down, this is that fight or flight piece. That fight or flight piece, this is where I always say, think about that bear. So I'm either going to run from the bear, or the challenge response is I'm going to fight that bear. Or the 10 befriend is, hey, I'm going to get with all these groups of people and we're going to protect ourselves together. So there's this different parts of the alert system. And lastly, especially with our students, it can make us very careful decision makers, cautious thinkers, and effective problem solvers because we're thinking through all of those worst case scenarios. So there's a lot of benefits to anxiety. There's a great TED Talk out there by Kelly McGonigal that says how to make stress be your friend. And she really breaks down, it's like 10, 15 minutes, a great TED Talk, but she breaks down each of these physiological responses that our body goes through. So that escalated heart rate usually is there when we're preparing ourselves for action or something that we're gonna go do. Breathing faster just increases that action to the brain, which is better use of our brain. And then that increase in oxytocin. Keep in mind, oxytocin is that cuddle hormone. It's what makes us social and want to strengthen relationships and be with others. So when we think about those physiological reactions to anxiety, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is rethinking and helping our children and students rethink those physiological responses is actually helping them rise to an occasion or that challenge. Another thing I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about is the importance of emotional vocabulary. So I'm going to own this a little bit as a clinician and a parent. I think the past 10 years, we've gotten a really bad habit of stop talking about different emotions. Even further, I'm going to kind of call us out that we started to lump all emotions into 1 or 2 or 3 categories. And so it's really important when we talk with our kids to remind them there's 27 human emotions. And really important is to say, is this truly anxiety or is there another feeling you have right now? As a quick example, often when someone says, hey, I have anxiety, and they're really talking about fear. Remember, fear is that known thing, something I've already experienced. Anxiety is that unknown. I have a son who always said, oh, I'm so depressed. You're not depressed, you're sad. And getting back to using the proper vocabulary to identify their emotions. If it is really anxiety, then one of the most powerful things we can do is break that word down for them. Anxiety, I always say when a student comes into my office and they say, I have anxiety, that's way too big. So anxiety tends to fall in three different categories. It's either stress, being overwhelmed, I have too much on my plate, I can't get it all done, or discomfort, which is a lot of students right now. They haven't done this before. They haven't had enough practice, and this is a new experience, so it's making them feel uncomfortable. And then that unknown, what's going to happen? What's next? I don't know the outcome, so I feel anxious. There was a great article I read about the power of the brain of a learner versus the brain of an expert. And what they talk about is this unknown, these new experiences. And when you're constantly learning, your brain is actually adapting and more adaptable to situations versus I know this answer. So there's a lot in the basic vocabulary. Let's make sure it really is anxiety, but then the power in really breaking down what that anxiety is for your student. Last and probably most important is naming it. And I always say renaming it because our kids tend to call it anxiety. They'll call it something, but the power is in renaming it. So a joke in my office, I have orange sticky notes. Orange is my favorite color. Sticky notes are all around me. But when a student comes into my office and says, Mrs. Berg, I'm so anxious, I have anxiety, I'll slyly open my drawer, pull out the sticky notes, and I'll say, okay, let's start to break this down. What are those things? The power of breaking it down and renaming those pieces of anxiety for your student is that they get to externalize it. They take it from the emotions and how their body is reacting it to name it something and put it outside of their body. This is absolutely necessary in order for a person to realize how to manage it. There was a great study done way back in 2007, but out of the study, they said just by naming the emotion correctly, the activity in the amygdala, which is that emotional alarm system, decreased. And what it found is that people who could name it accurately and externalize it actually felt more in control of it. So as we go to this next slide, and you can go, Julie. I just want to keep kind of our frame of mind here is the power of rethinking those physiological reactions as a good thing, and also the importance of that vocabulary, naming it properly, and then renaming it so it's something externalized. Now we're going to go actually into the managing part. So the bad news, we cannot avoid stress, discomfort, and the unknown. You know as well as your kids, you guys experience this. It is unavoidable. So ultimately, we can't avoid anxiety. Even further, as I go through some of those examples, I want to say this is where I really struggle when this is online, because I want to look you in the eye and say, if your student truly struggles from an anxiety disorder, this stuff is all the more important because that's likely to be a piece of them the rest of their lives. The good news here, though, they can learn to manage it. And by the end of this, I'm going to kind of share some things with you where I'm almost going to argue they might even embrace it. So important reminders in learning to manage anxiety. If you take nothing from today, this is the line I want you to take. Avoidance feeds anxiety. Again, I'm going to blame the clinicians in the world as well as us parents, but I think what happens with anxiety so often is when our student feels discomfort or overwhelmed, what we do is we tend to step in and we say, we don't want you to feel that emotion, so we're not going to have you do that experience, or we're going to take that away for you. Our heart is in the right place, you guys, every time. However, all of the research explains this. Avoidance only makes that anxiety bigger, literally feeding it. What happens is our bodies learn kind of an intolerance of those symptoms, the fast heart, the sweating, the stomach, all of these physiological reactions. Our body learns, oh my gosh, that's bad, I can't do this. And then what we learn is we're just going to escape from it. And then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And Julie and I see this all the time in the schools. What starts off as, I can't public speak, so I'm not going to do a speech, turns into, I can't go into a classroom without knowing someone else in there. And it turns into, I can no longer go into the pep assemblies and the lunchroom. And so these social events where someone might look at me turns bigger and bigger and bigger because these unknown experiences they go into, their body is going to have that same physiological reaction And all they learned in that avoidance was, wait a minute, last time I learned I don't have to go into this experience and then I won't feel this way.
Missy, can I chime in there?
Yeah.
I also see this a lot with the avoidance piece, that we accidentally send the kid the message that we don't have confidence that they can do it, which in turn impacts their level of confidence. So we kind of send a message unintentionally when we think we're doing a positive by alleviating that stressor and that intense emotion. It kind of has that underlying impact of, oh, they don't think I should or can do it either. So I think the more that we expose kids to that discomfort and tolerating the discomfort, it builds their confidence with each exposure, until they're actually confident and do it without, the anxiety impacting them so much.
Agree. Another thing with learning to manage is an important part for our students. So often when a young person comes in, they say, I have anxiety or I'm experiencing anxiety, period. And they stop there. And in my office, I always say we're going to have a dramatic pause because I'm looking at the student to complete that sentence. So it's really powerful when your student comes to you and says, Mom, I'm feeling anxious. Dad, I have anxiety. In order to move them from why me, victim, period, end of sentence, to what now, is we've got to throw that word and in there. You're feeling anxious right now. And what, go back to the sticky notes, what's causing this right now? What's on your plate? What's stressing you out? And is the most important thing. Don't let them stop at period. Exposure and practice is all, when we look at research and what they're finding with anxiety, exposure and practice is the most important piece and definitely the only way our kids will learn how to manage their physiological reaction, both that cognitive piece and that behavioral piece of managing the anxiety. And I put the word graded in here because it is important. When we're trying to help kids expose themselves to these feelings that don't feel comfortable, it's important to start small. So for that kid, an example for that kid who says, no, I can't do any public speaking, no speeches for me, I always say, okay, we're going to start by you giving your speech to a camera at home. Then you're going to give it to mom and dad and the dog. And then you're going to come give it to me and one of your friends. And then you're going to give it to the teacher and me. And then you're going to give it to half the class. And you keep building. That's called graded exposure. But what's important is for our student to expose and practice again and again and again, so that they learn how to manage that physiological reaction and not shy away from it. Really important here, when we talked about that anxiety being different things, our kids are learning, when I feel that physiological reaction, that is uncomfortable, and so I'm going to stay away from it. And we need to remind them, comfort versus growth. When we grow in our lives, and if you guys stop for a minute and think as a parent, when you grow in your lives, it's when you are reaching and stretching, not when you're comfortable. And what I always love to say about high school, this is the most supportive environment your student's ever going to have to be able to practice, get that feedback and support, and really learn how to expose and practice and work through this. The way I love to look at this is it's like a vaccine. How ironic that I bring up vaccine right now, but a vaccine is putting a small dose of that in you. And then your body learns, hey, I don't want this in here. I'm going to fight it off. And now I build that immunity. So that's the way you want to think of exposure and practice. To truly manage anxiety, we've got to give them that immunization, that vaccine, so they can learn on small levels to fight back and get back to feeling comfortable. As we go forward, I'm just going to share really quick with you as I go through these examples. I want to say to you, yes, I am a counselor. I have read every book out there on anxiety. This is definitely a passion for me, but it is first and foremost because I am a mom and I do have a son who really struggles with anxiety. So when I go forward with these examples, I'm just going to kind of use him. His struggles, when I look at the different pieces of anxiety, were always that he has to, kind of that perfectionistic, he has to be right, and he always has to get it done on time. So keep that in mind as I go through these examples, and I'll kind of help you see where I'm coming from. In order to manage, we're going to kind of break it into parents, students, and then the school resources, and then we'll get to your Q&A part. So for parents, first, this line, prepare your child for the path, not the path for your child, is in my signature page. It's on my wall. It's next to my bed. This is one of those phrases that I have to remind myself every day. As parents, we've gotten in a bad habit of thinking our job, it was called the helicopter parent for a long time, but then it became kind of that snowplow or curling parent, because we have this tendency to want to always clear the path. Well, we've got to stop and think. One of the things that drives me is I always envision, where do I want my kid to be at 18? And when you work backwards, they need practice. They're not just going to get it when they're 18. So every time we clear that path, a couple things happen. One, we're just strengthening that anxiety, because they said, oh, those uncomfortable feelings are coming. They come to us and we say, oh, then we're going to get that out of your way. And like Julie said, that also affects their confidence. That exposure and practice, when you guys stop for a second and think about the things you are most confident in, and really think about that. I am confident in this. There is only one way to confidence. Practice, 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 practice. The things we are confident in are the things that we do over and over and over again. So the way to look at anxiety, if we really want our young person to be able to manage it, it is getting out of the way and being there for a supportive role. Really fast story for you. The goal here is teaching them they actually can do it. My oldest daughter, long story short, was with a group of kids at Hannah Beardsley. When that group, 11 of the 12 girls, went to Prairie Ridge, and my daughter went to Central alone, or how she felt. As she went, it took us 8 days of dropping her off at school where she's crying. And because I'm a counselor and a mom, I was crying too. And on day 8, my daughter turned to me and said, thanks for knowing I can do this. That will never leave me. Like right now, goosebumps. You guys, my daughter didn't yet know she could do it, but the power there was not changing her path, but staying steady next to her, with her, so she could learn, I'm not there yet, but I know this lady believes in me. And that was enough to get her there to day 9, day 10. She's graduating this year. So keep that in mind when you are trying to, as a parent, help your child. The other thing, and I really want to emphasize, say this silently. You do not want to say this out loud. But every time a student or my child comes to me and says, hey, here's the problem, the first thing I have to say in my head, because I am a mom and a counselor, is this is not my problem to fix. As parents, we get in a really bad habit when our kid brings us something to feel like we are supposed to step in and fix that. I'm going to challenge, if there's any husband and wives out there, think for a second as the wife. When we go to our husbands and we kind of unload, I have to say, very first thing I have to say is, I don't want you to fix this. I just want you to listen. We have these tendencies to fix, yet we know when we go to someone with our problems, we don't want them to fix it. We just want them to listen and validate. So when you step in and you fix, 2 things happen. One, we shut down that emotion mid-heightened level. That's the worst thing we can do, because we need our young person to learn, I can get to the other side. My body will come back to that equilibrium. The other thing we do is we become the problem solver in there. So what do you think is going to happen the next time they're struggling with anxiety? They're going to say, well, last time I went to mom, she fixed it, I stopped that emotion, all was good. So now we're just going to create this negative feedback loop. I also want to take a second just to talk about the difference between support and coping. And I'm always going to take the blame on this one. I was in mental health for many years before switching into the schools. And I think we got in a bad habit of talking to young people about support and stop talking to them about coping. Think for a second about the difference in support and coping. Who does the work in support? And now think about who does the work in coping. Support is someone else doing the work. Coping is me doing the work. Both of these are very important pieces, but they need both. So when we think about supporting our kid, it's really 4 things. Listen, and it's really important here, listen with the intent of understanding where your child's coming from, not with the intent to fix it. Just listen with the intent to understand, which then helps us validate that feeling or that emotion. Once they have unloaded and you validated that emotion, then it becomes, what do you think will help? What do you want to try? It's questioning, not giving the answers. And then the last piece, which is really important, when your child decides this is what I'm going to go do, then it's really important to say, hey, how'd that go for you? Have them reflect on if it worked. If it didn't work, that's okay. This is that trial and error and that practice, practice, practice. But now come up with another one. If it did work, great. Let's do that again next time. Real important here is that little quote I have up there. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not to join their chaos, which might be one of the hardest things as a parent. This is where I remind myself several times a day, hold steady and be the bucket. What's nice for me in my job, I get a similar role at home as I do as a counselor. I have all the practice in the world built in, yet I have to say this to myself a million times a day. Hold steady and be the bucket. Kids are always going to look at your reaction. You know, when they were little and they would fall and they would kind of look at you, and if you went, they immediately said, nah, and it hurts. If you said, and you just kind of laughed or you picked a ball up or whatever, they watched every move you made and how you reacted. They're still doing that even though they're adolescents. Kids are going to look to you to interpret that situation, so it's really important to be that calm. Also, don't use false assurances. This is where we like to say, it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. As my daughter transitioned to that high school, I knew she'd be fine, but those were not the words I could use right in that moment, because then she just feels not understood, not heard. So don't use false assurances. Just listen and be in it with them. If in their anxiety, it is more about, hey, I need to know, we look at COVID right now and a pandemic, keep in mind, it is always smarter to use wisdom, facts, and principles when we're trying to help our young person understand something. But really go to those facts, go to them together versus sitting in that, well, I don't know the answer either, and then feeding into it. And the most important thing as a parent, as you think about your couple things you're going to do differently, be consistent in that role. I always say it's not easy, but it is simple. Every decision I make as a parent, I do pare it down into a couple things. Write them down next to your bed, on the fridge. Keep them where you are constantly going back to those strategies. Now for the kids. First, I want to start, I love doing this in person because we can get in a whole conversation about the movie Inside Out. It happened like 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if you ever saw it. But Inside Out had a moral to it. It was all about the little girl Riley needed all of her emotions. And Joy, the happy one in her, was trying to push anger and sadness and all these other emotions away because she just wanted Riley to feel happy all the time. Think about that for a second. Most of us parents want our kid to be happy. But you guys, that is so loaded. Our kid is not always going to be happy. We're not always happy. So it's really important to help our students remember all emotions, all 27 of them, are useful to us. They're not negative in and of themselves. And so often we need them just to do the problem solving. When we go back to what anxiety is, there's first always that physiological reaction. The good news about that physiological reaction, wait a minute, it's my alarm system. It's telling me something's not right here. That's a good thing. So all emotions are useful. Second, when we talked through that TED Talk, we need to help our young person rethink, what is that physiological reaction? Remember, it's just telling us something. So heart rate, breathing, oxytocin, all those pieces. How can we help them rethink those physiological reactions to actually be, I can do this. There's 3 different parts to managing anxiety, and I'll kind of use my son as an example to walk through this. But first is going to be that physical component. Your child cannot manage anxiety without developing coping skills that work for them. My magic number is 3. Every individual in the world should have 3 coping skills that they rely on when they are feeling an emotion like anxiety. It's important when they find these 3 coping skills that they are not in crisis, that they're not in the middle of that panic or anxiety. Examples, breathing. In a school, I love breathing because triangle breathing, breathing in 3, holding 3, out 3, any student can do in any environment and nobody even notices. Walking, any student in our buildings without any accommodations can say, hey, teacher, I'm gonna go get a drink of water. I'm gonna go to the bathroom. They can take a quick walk, splash water on their face and come back. Drawing, music, there's lots of coping out there. The power here as a parent is maybe sharing with your student what your coping skills are, but really encouraging them to develop those coping skills when they're not in crisis. I just want to speak really quick about the concern with phones and gaming systems. They're not negative in and of themselves, but when our students use phones or gaming systems to cope, the problem that we're finding, there's a bunch of research out there, is that the student will use that to distract themselves and kind of get that instant vacation. I have no problem with an instant vacation. Sometimes we're so in it, we need to step away from it just to be able to go back at it. But what they're finding is we're using phones and gaming systems to step away from it, and we're not going back to it. So unless it is a meditation app or something that you are watching your student use to calm their body, I'm going to argue that's not coping. The whole goal in this physiological response is to return our body to homeostasis. And the good news is their body will do that all on their own as soon as they release this emotion. The cognitive part can be a little more challenging. The cognitive part is where, again, we're trying to rename those stressors, the emotions, the beliefs, the inaccurate beliefs especially, as specific stressors. And remember, just naming it can be half of this battle. Here is where we really need to walk through those worst case scenarios with our students. For my son, who always had to have it right and always had to have it done, this was not comfortable, and I'll go into a little more details in the next slide. But it was walking through, what if you don't? What if you don't? What if you don't? And it was getting him to verbalize, what if I do get a C? How does that affect? And just walking him through each one of those steps. Don't give false assurances. Don't tell him it's going to be okay. Let him get all the way to the end of that. More times than not, by gently challenging those beliefs, they will realize that isn't detrimental. That isn't the worst case. That isn't so bad. But in dealing with anxiety, part of this is we have to get them all the way to the end of that. We can't cut them off. And that's hard as a parent because you're watching them as you go through this. But walking through worst case scenarios can be very powerful. The last piece then, they've kind of calmed their body. They renamed them as different stressors or things, externalized them. Then that last piece is the problem solving piece. And this is where it's really hard as a parent, but the most important thing we can help our kid do, exposure and practice, exposure and practice. Graded baby steps. I know you don't want to give that speech, or I know this is on your mind, and work kind of backwards to find a small place for them to start. This is where they get to move from why me, that emotion, or even bigger, that diagnosis, to what now, that and part. If your student is struggling with anxiety and you're doing your part and your kid is doing their part and it's still a struggle, I do want to remind you guys, I know school has looked so different this year, but you have a lot of supports in the school. First of all, in student services, every student has a counselor and social worker assigned just kind of by alphabet. We also have school psychologists. Our jobs with your student is going to be similar to yours. We're going to listen, we're going to validate that emotion, we're going to help them rename it, we're going to pull out our sticky notes, and then we're going to get to that problem solving piece. But part of me moving from mental health to a school, I always say, is because I want to be in it with the kid. When you're home and your kid is sharing this with you, they might not be in that stress. The power of it happening in the building and keeping your kids in the building once we get them in this building is to help them, when that emotion comes, walk through these steps. There's also nurses in every building, and nurses are not just for pandemic symptoms, but the nurses there, a lot of times with our anxiety, the first thing I'll do is take them up there just so the nurse can walk through the vitals with that student, which leads to me kind of doing some talking through why those emotions are, or what that physiological reaction is and what those things are telling the student. Meanwhile, helping the student breathe, but the nurse is a great person to kind of help your student rethink those physiological responses. We also all have some form of triage system. Triage is just where if a student is anxious that day and there's something going on in that moment, they can come to student services. There's always some staff member available to meet with that student and get through that moment. Many of us have skill-based groups where sometimes especially with anxiety, there's a 6 to 8 week group where we're building on these different skills for them to then go out and apply and kind of get that exposure and practice. I want to take a couple minutes here just to talk about accommodations, and this is where I will share with my son again. Accommodations are hard for me because I think we've gotten the last 5 years in this bad habit of when there is a diagnosis, that then my student, and I'm going to walk you through my example, qualifies for this plan or this IEP. So I want to take a second and just remind you as parents, just because there's a diagnosis, and I'm living this myself, just because there's a diagnosis, it doesn't mean that they automatically need accommodations or a plan. A plan, and this is really important, doesn't do anything for our kids. It doesn't treat disabilities. It doesn't even build skills. Ultimately, a plan just documents what works for our student. So think about that. If our student has found strategies that work for them, the power is in them knowing that, in you knowing that. Please share it with school, because again, this is where a lot of that anxiety is going to come from. It's stress-ridden. Share it with those people, but it doesn't mean you need this plan. We unfortunately, and again, I'll always blame mental health because I'm part of that, but we got in a bad habit of saying, well, great, then get them on a plan. Keep in mind, the plan doesn't do anything. The plan is only as good as the student knowing what works for them and us documenting that. So for my son, couldn't have had better teachers and social workers. This all kind of happened in 4th, 5th grade is when it started. And right away, as he struggled with, I need to get this done, and he couldn't transition to that next activity, they were wonderful. And they said, hey, why don't we let him finish these things at home? Additionally, he'd get really upset if he got things wrong, and he was very tearful, and it was really tough on him. And so again, the school said, hey, great, why don't we build in this extended time? That way he can always finish, and he can take this home and kind of make sure it's all right. Well, that was the time of my life when I started reading every book out there on anxiety. And the research is there. What I was reading was back to that importance of exposure and practice. And for my son, he needed to learn, I'm not always going to be right. I'm not always going to get it done. And so we built in a lot of graded practice for him in a very great environment of a lot of social support. I stayed away from the 504 plan. I stayed away from accommodations. My son's line these days is, well, you know how my brain works. That's how he's externalized this into a, hey, that's how my brain works. He isn't always right and he doesn't always get it done. But he's an 8th grader and he's going into high school and he's going to be okay. Another one that's big here is those speeches. Keep in mind, if we have a student who struggles with camera being on, social anxiety where I feel like people are looking at me, going into any large environment like pep assemblies, in lunchrooms, in classrooms where I don't know anyone. Our job as a parent, you guys, I'm a runner, so my analogy is always, this is the marathon, not the sprint. The sprint says, I need to fix this right now for my kids so that they're comfortable. The marathon says at 18, I want them to know they can manage their anxiety and they can be okay. So in order to do that, while they are in supportive environments and it's built into the school system, let them practice these small pieces. In addition to kind of the student services, triage, groups, accommodations, there is also referrals to community resources. So sometimes people are like, hey, great, so glad you're there, but we have a lot going on and we want to work with someone outside of school. Do know that we are a good referral system for you as well. One more slide and I'm done talking here. As you go forward with helping your student kind of manage the anxiety, I do want you to know most of the research out there points to the benefits of mindfulness and CBT very specifically with anxiety. So mindfulness is that type of meditation, focus on being in the moment. So for my son, one of the strategies they taught him was in the classroom when he was feeling anxious, was feet on the ground, this grounding type technique, and then pulling up on his chair, kind of telling his body, I need to be in this moment right now so that I don't think about all these uncertainties. It involves breathing and imagery. And again, what I love about breathing and imagery, they can do that anywhere. They can do that at home. They can do that in school. They can do it wherever they're feeling this anxiety. But it teaches the body to relax. The symptoms of anxiety and panic diminish. And then it refocuses that mind on the now instead of those what ifs or those uncertainties. And there's a ton of benefits to mindfulness. The other one is that CBT. CBT is a specific type of counseling, and this is some of the pieces we teach in those skill development groups in the schools. But the focus here is on those inaccurate and negative thinking, those outcomes they think are going to be there. So they kind of say A, the event that happens, plus B, your students' perceptions and feelings equals the outcome. And so CBT is all focused on B, on your students' perceptions and feelings and what they're doing with that event. You know, a line I always say is, it's not the event, it's what we do with the event that causes that next step. And then just a reminder as a parent, because I'm in this with you guys, there are a lot of great books out there. I would say this Helping Your Anxious Teen, it's a guide for, the first one up here, it's a guide for parents, is where I took so many strategies out of to practice with my son. There's a ton of other books too, but this was just kind of a starter for you guys. And that is it for me talking. One last slide just to challenge you here. I think really powerful for me is every time I read a book, every time I look at the research, every time I'm kind of working with a student or my own child, I always think about what is one thing I can do differently. And what's important here is for you to think of one thing you can do differently to help your child manage. And again, you got to remember, it's stress, discomfort, and unknown, inevitable things in their lives. When you think of something you can change at home, write it down, commit to it, make it happen. Because if you don't write it down and keep coming back to it, it's not going to. And kind of like the little quote up there, if we don't change something we're doing, the one thing all the research is pointing to, our role as parents is sometimes a bigger piece of this, at least at first, in helping our kids manage this anxiety. Write it down, commit to it, make sure it happens. Also, go home, share this with your student. This is going to be online where you can refer back to any of this. But what is one thing your student can do differently? And have them write that down. Have them commit to something they're going to try to do differently. Because remember, no one can avoid that stress, discomfort, or unknown, but we can learn to manage it. And I'm even going to argue most of us hopefully will learn to embrace it. It's just part of us. So now I think we get to do some discussion or Q&A and answer.
There are no questions in the Q&A right now. I guess I just wanted to kind of add a few things as far as, you know, support in the building. Missy stressed, and it is so important for that practice and exposure. You know, with those skills groups that we have, or even when we have kids who come in for triage regularly, that's exactly kind of what we're doing with them, is that practice. So I think that's why I love when we get to team with parents, because if we're kind of on the same page about, you know, pushing, even if it's baby steps for those exposures and those opportunities for them to experience the discomfort. And I even get my kids, you know, to say to themselves, I can tolerate this discomfort, you know, because I think with that anxiety word, there's so much power in that anxiety word. So once we kind of narrow it down and identify this specific stressor that's leading to the discomfort, they feel more in control of it. And so I think that practice in between, you know, just know that we do a lot of that here at school. So if it can be reinforced at home, or we're at least we're on the same page as far as kind of pushing for that exposure, as opposed to maybe excusing a kid on a day when they have a speech, you know, we would rather have the kid come in, even if we have to spend a whole period or two with them, you know, to kind of work through those emotions so that they can experience that success of actually facing that challenge and tolerating the discomfort. Because every time they do that, it does get a little easier the next time. So it's that practice that we do here, that I think really helps them build those skills.
And this is not an ideal format to do Q&A. Julie and I would much rather be in person with you guys and having conversations. We're still glad we got information out, but if you guys have questions, follow up, you can contact either of us. You can also contact the student services, whether it's the counselor or the social worker at your own building too. Because sometimes this is more personal and you kind of want to talk something out. I hope that this leads to some questions, and definitely follow up with one of us or student services in your building.
And Missy and I were talking before this presentation, and we'll just maybe end with this thought is, given the year that we have all had, most people, even adults, are experiencing stronger emotion and maybe a higher stress response or stress level. And so, we're seeing kids who have never been on the radar struggling in a way that we've never seen them struggle. And because they haven't struggled in that way, it is to a certain degree creating some panic because it's new, it's different, and usually they can cope and manage. So I guess I just want to say to you parents that we are seeing that increase significantly. So don't, not every kid is going to come out of this with an anxiety disorder, but those emotions can really be intense at times. And, we have some students just grieving the loss of things that they missed out on all year. And so, what I'm saying to parents is it's actually a pretty appropriate grief response. It's just, they're not used to it because usually their baseline is more in the middle. So everyone's kind of baseline is creeping up a little bit. And so just know that there are so many parents, struggling because their kids are struggling in a way they haven't seen before. So we hope tonight provided you some information on how to manage that. But I guess I don't want you to panic, because we will, we'll get them through this. And as we get more normalcy, and as they practice the skills, it will get better.
And it does look like, Julie, there's a question, and a couple comments. One of the questions is if a student is remote, they don't have access to kind of walk into student services. So how could they get support they need, like on the spot?
Sure. And this might vary from building to building. I can say at South, we do have a link on our student services Canvas page and web page where kids can click it and it goes to a live Zoom to our front desk, and we have somebody on call each period. I honestly have a lot of kids just seek me out. They'll shoot me an email and I will send them a Google Meet link because Zoom, obviously we have problems with still sometimes. And we can get on with them pretty immediately. I don't know, Missy, if all the buildings are still running triage. It seems that there would be someone available each period, even for the remote kids, right?
Yeah. And I would reiterate everything you said. I think a couple things. One, definitely reach out to, the student to reach out to counselor, social worker, whoever they're more comfortable with, whoever their relationship with. They can set up ongoing check-ins, because part of anxiety too is we want to get them not in the moment to start to practice these strategies so that in the moment it's there. So one, yes, triage we all have. But I would say start with the emailing the person they already have a relationship with, and then we just send you a Google Meet or a Zoom and we can talk with the student. Or set up that regular time, because then it's kind of built into their day and we know they'll use it during a free period or when they're more relaxed. So I would do both of those pieces.
And sometimes even just a student knowing they have that set time, once they're feeling, more in control and better managed, I'll keep them in my schedule for a couple weeks, and I say, just log on if you need it. And sometimes just knowing they have that, surprisingly kind of gives them that reassurance and confidence, and then they don't need it.
Mm-hmm. There's another parent kind of commented in great advice. shared just that she always brings up with her daughter not to focus on the things she cannot change or control. And this is one of my favorite topics, locus of control. Change the things we can, let go of the things you can't, and really breaking down, even with my lovely sticky notes, breaking down, okay, here's the 4 things you named. Which one, you know, and we kind of have a conversation, can you not touch right now? Which one is someone else's responsibility? Which one is, and you kind of have conversations about it, because then it helps them pare down to the 1 or 2 things they can control. I have a little cheat sheet electronically and then hard copy, kind of I call it the not to do list, where they're actually moving those things to different pieces where it's not in my control. So my only choice is kind of let it go. I always say there's kind of problem focused and emotion focused. Problem focus, yes, I can change the stressor. Emotion focus is no, I can't. So how do I learn to let that go? So I love that point. Another question, Julie, my daughter is a freshman and does not feel comfortable going to see anyone yet. If the parent reaches out, would it be possible for someone in student services to reach out to the daughter?
Yeah, I think we get pretty creative in our outreach efforts. You know, if, you know, as a student services office, you know, we're kind of the hub of the building. So kids are in and out of our offices all day long for academic issues, for social emotional issues. So, you know, if you feel like your student might be, you know, not really want to come in, you know, sometimes we'll just say, hey, we're checking in with our freshmen to see, you know, how the year is going, you know, how's the semester going. So we can be creative in how we reach out to students. I get, you know, kids, especially freshmen, they're not used to having, you know, that office as a resource. So if you just let us know, and we're, you know, doing that a lot right now, especially with kids remote, you know, parents will just kind of let us know, and we'll do the check-in via email. So yes, feel free to reach out, and we'll figure out a way to touch base.
Mm-hmm. And that's just a good way for you to kind of fill us in on what's going on. So we have some of that knowledge. And then I agree with Julie, you just get creative in the reasons we pull them in. We do, especially with this last year, we often use, we're getting to know all of our freshmen, we're getting to know all of our sophomores, juniors, seniors. There's a reason we need to see each grade level. So it's pretty easy for us. Mm-hmm. Well, again, you guys, thanks for showing up. Not the ideal setting, but we appreciate you guys being here, and please reach out to us or someone in your own building if it's not us, if this stirred any questions or you kind of want to know what something looks like as far as support.
Thank you.
We're in this with you guys. Not an easy year. Thanks so much for attending.